Well, now I'm delighted to introduce the first panel of the scientific program, which is entitled Disrupting Challenges in the Scientific Enterprise. Our moderator is broadcast journalist Judy Woodruff, the anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour. She's covered politics and other news for 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS, including as chief Washington correspondent for the PBS MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour and as anchor of the award-winning docuseries Frontline with Judy Woodruff. She and the late Gwen Ifill were the first 2 women to co-anchor a national news broadcast. Please join me in welcoming Judy Woodruff and our panelists to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here. I was only able to hear the end of the introductory remarks, but what a stimulating way to get today's session underway. I'm really very happy to be here, and I have to say, I haven't learned how to say no to Victor Zhao, so that's a lot of the reason that I'm here. And of course, there's not much going on in the news these days, so it was easy to slip away. So as everybody knows, our discussion has been titled Disrupting Challenges in the Scientific Enterprise. And we want to spend the next hour or so with a candid look at exactly that. What are the main challenges facing the scientific community and facing individual scientists and physicians, including future scientists and physicians who are committed to addressing our nation's greatest healthcare needs and healthcare gaps. There's no question with the COVID pandemic and its sweeping effect on all of our lives, with demographic changes in this country, with international developments, with shifts in immigration laws and policy, technological and scientific developments, with budget constraints that we're all very familiar with. This is a difficult moment for basic science, for medical science in the United States. And so we are so fortunate to have this extraordinary panel to tackle these questions this morning. I'm going to say their names and then say a little bit more about them when they speak. They are Dr. Neil Hanchard, Dr. Dietram Scheufele, Dr. Ali Shilatifard, and Dr. Huda Zoghbi. So welcome to all 4 of you. I'm going to give, as I said, a brief introduction when they speak, but I encourage you to please read their full biographies, which are printed in your program. They're each going to speak, just a word about the process here. They're each going to speak for about 6 minutes. We've been given strict instructions on what we're doing. Then we're going to have a discussion among ourselves for several minutes, after which you in the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. So let's begin with Dr. Neil Hanchard. He is the senior investigator with the Center for Precision Health Research. He's the head of the Childhood Complex Disease Genomic Section at the National Human Genome Institute. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Hanchard.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction and for the invitation to participate in this. It's truly an honor. So I wanted to start by talking about the challenge of diversity in the medical and scientific enterprise. I think all of us are aware that health disparities are well documented across the entire health and scientific spectrum. But I think more recently, we've started to learn about the importance of who we study and about who studies the who that we study. And so just for a few minutes, I wanted to use some examples from my own field, which is in human genetics, to sort of illustrate this. But I'm sure it's true for almost every other specialty. So in human genetics, we've known for some time now that there is a diversity gap. Here, looking at genome-wide association studies. These are genetic studies using thousands of individuals, of which there have been thousands of studies. And we knew for a long time that the vast majority of these occurred in individuals of European ancestry. If we fast forward now to 2022, you'll see that the situation is not much better, and it's arguably a little bit worse. And in fact, if we look at very large sequencing studies where people sequence the genomes of hundreds of thousands of individuals, again, underrepresented populations remain underrepresented. And this has its own detriments. So if you take a composite of genetic variants and you try and develop these risk scores, you'll almost always find that the accuracy of that risk score is lower in non-European individuals. And this is the same thing that happens when we start to think about artificial intelligence or machine learning in healthcare. What you train and who you train your initial algorithms on has a downstream effect. And this downstream effect is real. It actually affects patients. So this work coming out of Vanderbilt demonstrating that individuals with this genetic variant, which predisposes them to a benign low white blood cell count. The variant is much more common in individuals of African ancestry, but we find that these individuals are much more likely to have a biopsy, bone marrow biopsy, even though that is almost always going to be negative. And so this is an example where the clinical algorithms that were put in place don't really take into consideration having the full diversity of the genetic spectrum that is present in the population. Conversely, on the other end, diversity actually is very much augments medicine. One of the best examples is PCSK9. Loss of function variants in this gene are associated with lower cholesterol and have since been translated into downstream medications. But almost all the individuals with these loss of function variants were African American in ancestry. And so essentially this study wouldn't have been positive if those individuals weren't included. In fact, even though the participants in these genome-wide association studies are overwhelmingly European, non-European individuals have an outsized contribution to the actual associations and findings that are found in these studies. And we have done sequencing, genome sequencing in just a handful, 400 or so individuals from the African continent, and identified millions of variants that have not been previously cataloged or captured. And this has the effect, this has a strong effect, we believe, on sort of genomic medicine. It provides a broader reference and certainly helps in the diagnosis of very rare disorders as well. And of course, this problem of the diversity gap is sort of further augmented when you think about the who is doing the studying. So this is data from the NIH showing that individuals, say African Americans, remain heavily underrepresented among PhD recipients. This gets translated further when you start to talk about the career ladder, particularly as you go higher up towards professor and department chair. There's a continued degradation. And of course, this again translates into what we see with research grants and the number of individuals from underrepresented groups who are participating there. So, what do we do? I think one of the things to think about is the simple idea that we have to be more mindful about who we study. This is something that the All of Us program in the NIH has been particularly mindful about, ensuring that there is this engagement with communities to ensure a broader representation of individuals. But this needs to be the norm and not the exception. Similarly, we also have to think about ensuring that all the inlets to our pipelines in academia are filled and are accessible to individuals across the spectrum of ancestries. But it's also evident that it's not going to be sufficient to just do this in the United States. We need to be engaging internationally in a meaningful way, and particularly engaging investigators in that context, because it's now sort of well understood that by just having those kinds of touch points, you have this ripple effect that then goes out and impacts the rest of the field and the society. So I'm going to stop there and just thank you again for the opportunity and look forward to the discussion forthcoming.
Thank you, Dr. Hanchard. Our next panelist is Detrimental Scheufele. He is the Taylor Bascom Chair in Science Communication and the Villas Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and in the Morgridge Institute for Research. You're next.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for letting me share what I'm hoping are three big challenges and opportunities that also echo some of the things that we've heard all morning. And I will push back a little bit on the idea that science, in the first challenge, that science during COVID was science at its best and worked the way science is supposed to work, meaning in a self-correcting way. And we knew that going in. Many of you saw Adam Marcus's and Ivan Oransky's piece in Wired warning us early in the pandemic that science would produce missteps, and as long as we knew that we would be fine. We had actually written about this in the replicability and reproducibility consensus study report, where it said, look, if you see a single study result that contradicts bodies of work, you should be careful about that. And if you should basically never draw conclusions based on single studies. But of course, during COVID, that's exactly what we did. We battled it out in the New York Times, one study on mask wearing versus the other, which of course, as a scientific debate, is largely meaningless. And there's some really good, there were really good reasons for that. We were faced with a really unenviable dilemma as a community. We had to correct information that we knew to be wrong with science that we were not quite sure would turn out to be right. And that was not a good position to be in, and it left us extremely vulnerable to political attacks. Here's a tweet from Laura Ingram, who said, well, next time they tell you to trust the science, and Victor spoke to this morning, think of all the studies that got retracted and turned out not to be true. We also heard this morning points about trust. These are data from the General Social Survey. These are the data that typically go into the science indicators that the NSF puts out. And if you look at the latest iteration, you see a wide gap between liberals and the rest of the country. Those are both independents and Republicans, who make up about 7 in 10 Americans. And that gap is partly produced by us not having taken Republicans and independents with us, but largely by liberals being really excited about science as a partisan tool because Trump didn't believe in science and we do. And the moment science becomes a partisan tool, we're in deep, deep trouble. I'll come back to that in a second. That brings me to our second challenge, and Victor also spoke to this morning, and that is that we're operating in a fundamentally different, algorithmically curated environment, information environment, than we used to have. Facebook is pretty flippant about this. This is Adam Kramer at Facebook, who has said that Facebook is the largest field study in the history of the world. And that's true, except for it's one that most of us have absolutely zero access to in the academic community. It's proprietary data that's largely inaccessible to us. And as we're trying to figure out as scientists how to better communicate, we're doing so on a platform that is optimized for outrage and conflict, not on a platform that's optimized for consensus and for settled science. So how do we communicate settled science on a platform that is designed for the exact opposite, meaning for disagreement and questioning each other? How do we have debates about reasonable disagreements on policy while bringing in the best available scientific evidence? And how can we get consensus across in those settings? That brings me to the third challenge, and that dovetails really nicely from one of the last slides in the keynote, and that is, why are we being so unscientific when it comes to communication? This is a study that many of you know. It's more than 40 years old, and it has eerie wording given what we went through in COVID, an unusual Asian disease which expects to kill 600 people. That eventually was one of the studies that won Daniel Kahneman a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. It depends, of course, how you respond to those 600 that are affected, and if you believe in an intervention like mask wearing or vaccination. If I tell you in the first condition that 200 people will live, or in the second condition that 400 people will die. Meaning, if we frame it as a gains, as something that is actually worth working toward versus a loss, we're much more likely to get buy-in. Well, what happened during COVID, this is a study from 84 countries in terms of how we ended up framing COVID, and we framed it as the 400 people dying, meaning loss framing. with no clear benefits in terms of behavioral or other outcomes. So 40 years later, and this really echoes what we heard in the keynote, we're repeating the same mistakes because we're not paying attention to the best available science that's out there. So let me use my last minute just to highlight or reframe this, and listen to my own lessons and reframe this as opportunities rather than problems. One is, I think we need to think for the next 50 years, as Victor queued it up earlier, about are our scientific structures ready for what we have called in a piece in Slate and in Issues, accelerated wickedness. There were no best scenarios out of COVID, and we had to make decisions really quickly. Lots of studies got retracted, and they got retracted not for malfeasance or misconduct, and that's a good thing. They got retracted because they probably shouldn't have been published in the first place, and we pushed them through way too fast. And that ended up causing long-term damage to science, and we need to do better the next time around. Number two, when it comes to new information environments, we typically respond and we say, well, we need to build literacy. People need to better grasp these new algorithmically curated environments. But that's like telling Kasparov after he lost to Deep Blue that he needed to up his chess game. Deep Blue was created to beat humans at chess. Facebook was created to exploit human vulnerabilities in cognition and in emotion. So our collaborations likely should be with platforms and at a very different level in order to create an information environment that has democratic benefits in the long run. And the last thing I'll say is the power of social science. When Francis Collins left the NIH, he said, I wish we had more social and behavioral sciences to guide us. The fact that he doesn't know about this is partly due to social sciences not communicating in a way that touches other fields and that informs the work in fields like this. So I think that the onus is very much in the social sciences themselves. And I just want to end on mentioning the National Academies Committee on Advancing Science Communication that within the academies is trying to do exactly that. So I'll leave it at that and apologize for having gone over a few seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scheufele. I would just add that Francis Collins said that in an interview I did with him. No comment on that. Our next panelist is Dr. Ali Shilatifard. He is the Robert Francis Furchtgott Professor of Biochemistry and Pediatrics and Director of the Simpson Querry Institute for Epigenetics at Northwestern University. He's also the editor of Science Advances, the magazine. Dr. Shilatifard.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and last night was great to be among you. So as mentioned, I'm a biochemist, and I study chromosomal translocation that involve in pathogenesis of heme malignancies in children. So I sort of go into different meetings throughout my career, both clinical and also scientific. And I've made a religious habit of attending all the poster sessions because, it's a good way of learning all what's going on in the field from the student and individual who are doing the work. So the topic that I like to discuss today is that how do we recruit, inspire, promote, and retain our workforce, our basic biomedical scientists, as students, postdoc, faculty, and inspire them to do what all of us love doing, experimentation, discovery, which result in things such as COVID vaccine come out of molecular biology and next generation sequencing. So attending all of these meetings and listening to the posters, an alarming statistic, just my own statistics that come to me, is that large proportion of the students that I have spoken to during the past year or so have chosen not to go to academia for their postdocs. They're going into pharma, they're going to industry, they're doing some sort of a financial business, or they're just changing the whole career. And so I have, written editorial about this. I've talked to Dr. Zoghbi about this. I've talked to my colleagues. And so I'm here today to sort of share with you the problem I see and how are we going to solve this issue as a country together. Because if we don't have strong biomedical research, strong science, we will not advance, right? So to develop a collaborative environment that provides us infrastructure to have what we want to have, there are many parts to it. I think mentorship is very important. how do you inspire students, not only graduate students and medical students, but, kids in the 1st grade and 8th grade, to love science and want to do science and do science for the joy of it. How do you provide equitable educational opportunities? This doesn't, again, start at graduate school and medical school. We need to start that at elementary grade. All of us got hooked on science sometimes early in our lives, right? I did at 5 with my grandfather, right? So I think we really need to inspire youngers to do that. And most importantly, how do you disseminate scientific information? So I'm not going to tell you about my science, but I'm going to put my editor hat on and tell you about dissemination of science. And towards the end, maybe I'll spend a minute with you, just say something about funding, because, I think that has been a major issue as well as we discuss how do we move on to the next stage and having others join our team to do science with us. All right. So ability to publish groundbreaking work within a well-read, well-respected journal in a timely manner is definitely a desire for all of our trainees. They all want to publish in the glossy journals. Why do they want to do it? Because if they don't, they're not going to get a job. And somewhat this is true because when we look at the promotion committees, when we look at the hiring committees, those are very important things where the work is published, carries quite a bit of a weight, but some other committees, look at the in-depth what is published in a given paper. So where to publish, I think, becomes a very important issue to discuss. And where to publish is that what is the reputation of the journal that you have. So, and I'll tell you about this journal that we started when Dr. McNutt was the editor-chief of science with the Science Family, and now under leadership of Dr. Holden Thorpe. And I've served as the editor of the journal since its inception. It's called Science Advances. And it's an open access journal, and we have one criteria, and our criteria is that how do you set the standard for your journal? And the way we set the standard at Science Advances within Science Family is that we hire the best of the best practicing scientists as our deputy editors. These are leaders in their given field. And we ask them one question. When a paper comes to you, are you willing to put your coffee down and read it? And if the answer is yes, that paper should go out for review. And that paper goes to their associate editors, whom also rising star and fantastic scientists in a given field that they have. And they ask the same question, and if they agree with the editor, then the paper goes to the reviewer. And we ask one question from our reviewer. Does the data support the conclusion? And if the answer is yes, we need to publish, right? And I think this is what we have started. The journal was started in 2014-15. We received about 700 papers with a handful of editors. And 7 years into it are hitting somewhere about 20,000 annual submission, over 500 editors. And now the question for us becomes, how do you publish things and disseminate this knowledge in a timely manner? And we have a fantastic office run by Laura Rimas and her team that really push the editors to make sure they stay on time, because we want to make a decision as rapidly as possible. And if we decide to review, we want to send those papers out review. And I think this is one way for us to see how to solve the problem. So you're in the audience. If you're asked to review for us, join the team. Please do it, because this is a great thing for our community, because it's a community-ran journal. And I think that's probably solved an issue regarding publication and the frustration that the trainees are having, because they see you and I spend years on a paper, years on a grant, and don't get it. And so I don't want to do this. I'm going to go do something else. And I think Science Advances is pushing forward at least to solve that problem. The one challenge that I want to discuss has nothing to do with the publication is that, how do you compensate scientists and provide them a fair level of support, not for themselves, but also for their research? And I can spend an hour talking about this. Actually, I wrote an editorial on this thing. I encourage you to read this. And there's a dire need for the support of molecular research. And what talks about is that NIH funding, when I started my career 25 years ago, was $250,000, and maximum you could get was about 2 grants. 30 years later, there's $250,000 NIH R1, and maximum you can get probably is 2 grants. But a lot has changed with the salaries, with the price of the antibodies, all of that. And the value that NIH R1 had 30 years ago is basically 1/3 today. And that's really setting us back. And I encourage you to read this editorial. And we should think about, as a community, how we can encourage NIH to change their ways of being able to fund more R1s where we can do most molecular research. So with that, I stop.
Thank you very much. And And our fourth panelist we are delighted to have with us is Huda Zoghbi, Dr. Huda Zoghbi. She is professor at the Baylor School of Medicine. She's investigator with Howard Hughes Medical Institute. She's also director of the Jan and Dan Duncan Neurological Research Institute. Welcome, Dr. Zoghbi.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. So today I'm going to focus on the physician scientist among the group of scientists, because we do need this group. This is majority of the members of the National Academy of Medicine also have are physician scientists. And I thought I'll start with a personal story. I was trained as a pediatric neurologist, and I had no idea I will do science. But while in the clinic, I encountered medical problems, neurological problems that I thought the only way to help my patients is to do research. With no training in basic science, how am I going to transition? And I was fortunate that I identified a problem. I had this one big family I could study to find the gene and a great mentor, but that was the only thing I had. No preliminary data, no additional training, and I want to hit the ground running. And I was fortunate that during my clinical training, I could write what's called a KO8 or mentored training application, and started in the lab with funding in hand. That's back then. Today, a physician, if the same thing happens to them, they have to have so much more clinical data, material, preliminary data, and they're challenged. They cannot get that funding, they'll be discouraged, they will never take that same career path. So that has to change. And of course, I'm just now going to go through additional challenges they face. The publications, everybody's pressured to publish in high impact journal. Everybody is pressured to have a grant before they go on a competitive job. And often the grant doesn't cover the salary above the NIH cap for physicians, so they can get pulled to do more and more clinical work, taking them away from research. Many of them have debts, so the financial pressure gives them the option then to go into private practice or clinical practice or pharma. And there is a frustration about getting access to data. I hear that from many, and especially for junior investigators. They have no recourse. They don't know how to complain without hurting their careers when they can't get access to published data. And lastly, many do not feel prepared to navigate an academic career. So these are our challenges. And what I thought I'll do is I'll just run through very few ideas so that we can maybe set the stage for our discussion with you. I think we begin to address these challenges, as we discussed earlier. Funders, NIH, foundations, and other funders, they need to think about ways to invest in physicians whose inspiration happened during the clinic. So they may not have a science background, but if they're committed to that, we do not want to lose this population. I would not have been a scientist if nobody invested in me at that time. We need to support physicians who wish to collaborate with scientists. This doesn't take major effort. A small amount of time protection will be helpful. And this is the prime time to do it. Today, surgeons are in the operating room day in and day out, getting access to various tissues from humans. That is so valuable for scientific discovery. But they don't have that skill. However, if they have a little bit of protected time, funded time, so that they can collaborate with basic scientists, hand off that tissue, we are more likely to make very meaningful discoveries. Another thing we need to think about, we have to think about funding beyond the NIH cap, at least also for certain specialties. Take, for example, neurosurgeons. The brain can benefit so much, brain research, from having neurosurgeons who are clinicians engage in research. This is a true piece of data from a neurosurgeon who's mapping the tract in the brain to do deep brain stimulation for a psychiatric disorder. If we protect the neurosurgeon's time, if we give them the time they need beyond the NIH cap, because otherwise you will never recruit neurosurgeons to be in research. They'll be pulled into clinical practice. We can have them. Even a clinician who doesn't do any research, having that clinician given protected time to talk to a computer scientist, so that now the data that the computer scientist will learn from the clinician with all the nuances in clinical medicine will be the input to all the machine learning and artificial intelligence program that's being developed. The more we have good output, meaningful output, the more we will have better algorithms to solve our problems. But unfortunately, our clinicians don't have any time to spare to sit down with the computational scientists and have that dialogue. These are opportunities that are different from how we did medicine a few years ago that we should capitalize on. So I want to also address the idea of the access to data. I think there have to be consequences. NIH demands it, but there are no consequences. Something has to be put in place. Of course, institutions have to play a role. The committees have to focus about the work, not where it is published. All of us, all of our search committees have to take that. And we have to encourage collaborations. And we have to really recognize a scientist for their collaborations if they're part of a team for what they've done. They don't have to be always individual. Science is changing. And as I mentioned, we need to support our physician scientists and treat them as we would basic scientists with proper packages to protect their time. And they ask for mentorship in soft skills. They need that. They don't need no financial aspects of running a lab. We need to dedicate time for that. We also need to educate the mentors in these soft skills to help ensure that there's a healthy lab environment and mentors are attentive to the vulnerability of women, underrepresented group. They're highly capable, but the confidence sometimes need that mentorship skill. And last, I don't want to forget industry. I think the investment in preparing trainees typically happens in academia, but companies and various industries are the great beneficiaries from that. So industry builds on the discoveries, on many discoveries that happen in academia. However, this pipeline is going to dry if students do not pursue postdoctoral fellowships, as you just heard from Ali. Industry needs to be a partner with us. They have to be a partner by contributing to the support of trainees. This can come in special funds, perhaps given unconditionally to special foundations, NIH, to mentor the next generation, and to also perhaps support clinicians so they can contribute to the science engine. Thank you.
Thank you.